South Korea is building new warships, but its real strategy is preparing for a more dangerous decade. New warships. Same old enemy. This is South Korea's new strategy. It's Korea's first fully domestic destroyer, built to break free from American aegis.
In the middle of June 2026, South Korea made two defense decisions within days of each other that together reshaped the country's strategic posture. The first was industrial. The Defense Acquisition Program Administration awarded Hanwha Ocean the contract to design and build 6 next-generation destroyers under the KDDX program, beating its longtime rival Hyundai Heavy Industries after a contest that had dragged on for nearly 2 years. The second was doctrinal. The Ministry of National Defense publicly reaffirmed that the North Korean regime and its military remain South Korea's enemy, flatly denying a media report that suggested the language might be softened in the upcoming defense white paper. Taken separately, these look like routine bureaucratic news. Taken together, they reveal a government building hard power with one hand, while its own cabinet argues over the language of peace with the other. This video breaks down both decisions, the data behind them, and what they signal about where the Korean peninsula is heading through the rest of this decade. The KDDX program, formerly the Korean Destroyer Next Generation Project, covers 6 new destroyers in the 6,000 to 6,500 ton class, with a total program value of roughly 7.8 trillion won, or about $5.7 billion. On June 11th, the Defense Acquisition Program Administration notified both bidding companies that Hanwha Ocean had won the detailed design and lead ship construction contract by a final score of 93.9542 against Hyundai 93.3675. That gap of 0.5867 points sounds tiny, and it was, which is exactly what makes the story interesting. These destroyers are meant to bridge the gap between the older KDX-2 class and the larger Aegis-equipped KDX-3 ships, adding capable hulls to the fleet without pulling South Korea top-tier missile defense assets away from their primary mission. The program traces back to 2011, with Hanwha Ocean predecessor, Daewoo Shipbuilding and Marine Engineering, completing the concept design in 2012, and Hyundai finishing the basic design in late 2023. Investors clearly understood the stakes. Hanwha Ocean stock jumped nearly 8% on the Seoul exchange immediately after the announcement, while Hyundai shares barely moved. Here is the detail that actually decided the contract. In the technical evaluation alone, Hyundai Heavy Industries scored higher than Hanwha Ocean, 73.2383 against 72.5958, which on paper should have made Hyundai the winner. But the Defense Acquisition Program Administration applied a 1.2-point security deduction to Hyundai final score, and that single penalty flipped the entire outcome. The penalty traces back to a case in which 9 Hyundai employees were convicted of illegally photographing and leaking confidential KDDX concept design documents that had originally been developed by Daewoo Shipbuilding, the company that became Hanwha Ocean. 8 of those employees were found guilty in 2022, and the 9th conviction was finalized in December 2023. Hyundai argued the penalty should have already expired by November 2025. But after an internal legal review, the acquisition agency decided the deduction should run through December 2026, based on the date the final conviction was confirmed. Hyundai tried to block the outcome with an injunction request, and the Seoul Central District Court 50th Civil Division rejected that request on June 5, just days before the contract result was announced. The company has said it plans to request a formal debriefing to understand the basis for the decision, and further legal appeals remain a live possibility. Beyond this single contract, the 1.2-point deduction has set a lasting precedent across South Korea's defense industry, signaling that information security compliance now carries weight equal to pure technical performance in future procurements. What makes KDDX more than just another shipbuilding contract is what is actually being built. South Korean officials and industry sources describe it as the country's first destroyer project to develop both the hull and an Aegis-type combat system entirely with domestic technology, earning it the informal nickname of a mini Aegis destroyer, equipped with 9 core systems built inside Korea rather than licensed from abroad. The combat system is centered on an integrated mast built by Hanwha Systems, combining an S-band radar for long-range air surveillance and ballistic missile tracking, with an X-band radar for short-range air defense and surface target detection, all folded into a single low-profile structure that reduces the ship radar signature. The class is also expected to be the first South Korean combat ship to use an integrated electric propulsion system, which cuts mechanical noise for better submarine detection and leaves extra electrical capacity for future high-power sensors and weapons. Reported armament includes a 5-inch deck gun, 2 close-in weapon systems for last-ditch missile defense, 8 anti-ship missiles from the Haeseong family, and a new generation surface-to-air missile being developed by LIG Nex 1 specifically for this class. None of this makes KDDX a replacement for the larger Aegis destroyers already in the fleet. Instead, it is meant to sit between the older KDX-2 ships and the KDX-3 Aegis destroyers, adding more capable, harder-to-detect hulls without overloading South Korea's most expensive missile defense assets. On June 18th, South Korea Ministry of National Defense flatly denied a newspaper report suggesting it might drop the word enemy from the 2026 Defense White Paper. A deputy spokesperson stated there had been no change in the ministry position that the North Korean regime and its military remain South Korea's enemy, and confirmed the biennial white paper is still being drafted for release around the end of the year. This label carries a long and politically loaded history. It first appeared in 1995, a year after North Korea threatened to turn Seoul into what it called a sea of fire during tense nuclear talks. The phrase was softened to military threat under the liberal Roh Moo-hyun government in the mid-2000s, then reinstated after North Korea torpedoed a South Korean naval vessel in 2010. The most recent white paper, covering 2022 and published in early 2023 under the conservative Yoon Suk-yeol government, again named the regime and its military as the enemy, and no edition was published in 2024 because of the political chaos surrounding Yoon's failed martial law declaration and impeachment. So far, the Defense Ministry has not moved an inch from that position, which tells you something important about how South Korean institutions actually work, since even under a progressive president built around dialogue with the North, the military bureaucracy retains enough independence to override the diplomatic wing of its own cabinet. The Ministry of Unification, which handles inter-Korean affairs under President Lee Jae-myung, has pushed back hard against the Defense Ministry's stance. Its position rests on the argument that calling North Korea the main enemy is incompatible with the administration's stated goal of peaceful coexistence, built on 3 principles of respecting the North political system, ruling out absorption-style unification, and refraining from hostile acts. Unification officials have also noted that past liberal governments generally avoided the term, framing their objection as a continuation of precedent rather than a new demand. Defense officials counter that the enemy label is not political theater but the legal and operational foundation for South Korea's 3-axis defense system, covering preemptive strike planning known as kill chain, missile defense known as KAMD, and the massive retaliation doctrine known as KMPR. Removing the label, in their view, would create real ambiguity for budget justification, training doctrine, and the rules frontline commanders operate under. The fact that this fight is happening openly, and that the Defense Ministry is currently winning it, shows that South Korea's threat assessment apparatus operates on its own institutional logic, one that does not simply bend to whichever party controls the presidency. The Defense Ministry's refusal to soften its language cannot be separated from what has happened between Pyongyang and Moscow over the past 2 years. North Korea and Russia signed a mutual defense treaty in June 2024, formally obligating each side to assist the other in case of attack, and both countries' parliaments ratified that agreement by November of the same year. So this alliance is mature rather than new, and it has already reshaped the security environment Seoul has to plan around. Open-source reporting suggests Russia has provided North Korea with sensitive missile telemetry and atmospheric re-entry technology, assistance that could meaningfully improve the accuracy and reliability of Pyongyang intercontinental ballistic missile program. On June 10, President Lee Jae-myung joined European Union leaders in his strongest statement yet against North Korea, condemning Pyongyang's support for Russia's war in Ukraine, and calling for an immediate halt to its nuclear and missile programs. North Korea responded 3 days later by denouncing the joint statement as a violation of its sovereignty, and describing Lee's entire peaceful coexistence policy as nothing more than a facade. Against this backdrop, South Korean naval modernization looks less like routine planning, and more like a hedge against a diplomatic track that Pyongyang itself keeps publicly rejecting. North Korea has also unveiled its own Cho Hyong-class destroyer, a vessel unusually heavily armed for its size, carrying around 74 vertical launch cells, a number that actually exceeds what several Chinese and Russian destroyers carry, even though the ship itself remains smaller than the largest American Arleigh Burke-class hulls. For China, South Korean naval buildup matters less as a standalone threat and more as a sign of how tightly Seoul is integrating into a broader allied industrial bloc. The scale gap is enormous to begin with, since the United States Navy currently operates around 290 ships compared to China, roughly 331, and Chinese shipyards are reportedly capable of producing as many as 10 destroyers a year, several times the pace of American yards. South Korea is the world's second-largest shipbuilding nation, and that capacity has caught Washington attention, with a former United States Navy secretary publicly acknowledging that the service faces serious labor capacity problems at home. The Pentagon has been formally exploring whether allied shipyards in Japan and South Korea could help build or maintain American warships faster, looking specifically at platforms like Japan Mogami-class frigate and South Korea Daegu-class. From Beijing perspective, a Korean shipbuilding base increasingly woven into American and Japanese supply chains is a more troubling long-term development than 6 additional destroyers on their own. Japan's relationship with this build-up mixes genuine industrial rivalry with strategic convergence, since Japanese and Korean shipbuilders now compete directly for export contracts, even as President Lee and Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi have exchanged official visits, and trilateral security coordination between Washington, Seoul, and Tokyo continues to deepen. KDDX is also South Korea's calling card for an export push that goes well beyond the Korean peninsula. Hanwha Ocean has been aggressively pursuing Canada Patrol Submarine project, presenting its KSS-3 submarine design alongside industrial investment pledges, and reported figures for that program vary widely across sources, ranging from roughly $20 billion on the low end to estimates approaching $100 billion once full life cycle costs are counted, which is itself a sign of how large and contested this opportunity has become. South Korea's broader track record exporting platforms like the K9 howitzer and the FA-50 has already built credibility with buyers in Europe, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia, and a successfully delivered KDDX would add a fully domestic destroyer to that portfolio. The same security compliance precedent set by the HD Hyundai penalty case is likely to matter here too, since foreign buyers evaluating sensitive naval technology will be watching how seriously South Korea enforces its own information security standards. None of this guarantees success in any specific tender, and competition from Japan and Germany in adjacent markets remains intense, but it does mean KDDX carries commercial weight well beyond the 6 hulls it will actually deliver to the South Korean Navy. The most immediate risk to KDDX is not diplomatic, it is legal. HD Hyundai request for a formal debriefing and the possibility of further appeals mean the contract signing originally expected by the end of July could still slip, and the broader program has already lost roughly 2 years to disputes over bidding rules and security penalties since its original 2024 start date. Even if everything proceeds on schedule, the lead ship path to active service will take years, and several industry observers expect the full 6-ship delivery to stretch well past the original 2030 target. On the doctrinal side, expect this same fight between the Defense Ministry and the Unification Ministry to resurface every time a new white paper cycle comes around, because nothing about North Korea posture, its alliance with Russia, or its own rhetoric towards Seoul gives South Korea military planners much room to soften their position. The deeper pattern connecting both stories is structural rather than political, since regardless of who occupies the presidential office in Seoul, the institutions responsible for assessing real-world threats are operating on a different clock than the politicians responsible for selling peace. And through the rest of this decade, that gap is likely to keep defining how South Korea builds its military, even as its government keeps talking about coexistence. KDDX is more than a counter to North Korea. KDDX will serve as a forward sensor node for South Korea's 3-axis system, feeding kill chain targeting, extending KAMD tracking, and enabling KMPR retaliation, while marking Seoul's shift from a peninsular frontline state into a regional military-industrial power, whose shipyards are increasingly vital to U.S. Indo-Pacific logistics.